It is early morning in Athens, and the city is already awake. Down the slope of the Acropolis, past the olive groves and the Potter's Quarter, through the narrow streets still cool with the last of the night air, tens of thousands of people are moving toward the same place. They have been moving since before dawn. Some have walked from the outlying demes of Attica, villages an hour or two beyond the city walls, rising before dawn to make the journey in time. Others slept nearby, wrapped in cloaks on the stone steps, unwilling to risk losing their place. They carry food, wine, cushions. They carry the mood of a festival, loud, argumentative, alive. This is the Great Dionysia, the most important event in the Athenian year, and the limestone bowl carved into the southern slope of the Acropolis is filling fast. 15,000 people will sit here today. Watch them arrive. There is a man near the middle of the crowd, unremarkable to look at, short, broad, with a flat nose and bare feet despite the chill. He is already in argument with someone, gesturing with both hands, pressing a question the other man clearly does not want to answer. He does this everywhere he goes. In the Agora, in the gymnasiums, at dinner parties he was not invited to. He has no money, no official position, no written work to his name. He owns nothing except the questions. In 30 years, this city, this same democratic city, these same people filing into these same seats, will put him on trial, convict him by a margin of 60 votes out of 501, and execute him for asking too many questions in public. His name is Socrates. But that is 30 years away. This morning he is just a man in the crowd, barefoot, still arguing. A few rows ahead, a citizen settles into his seat and turns a small object over in his hand. It is a piece of broken pottery, a shard scratched with a name. The Athenians call it an ostracon. Every year the assembly votes on whether any man in the city has grown too powerful, too dangerous, too close to becoming a tyrant. And if they decide yes, every citizen scratches a name onto a shard of pottery and drops it in. 6,000 votes, and the man named must leave Athens for 10 years. No trial, no charges, no appeal. Just the collective judgment of the people, written in broken clay. The device is elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its application. It has already driven out generals and statesmen. The idea that power belongs to the people and can be taken back, held in a single piece of discarded pot. Closer to the front, in the rows reserved for them by the state, sit young men in armor. They are the sons of soldiers who died fighting for Athens. The city has raised them since their fathers fell, fed them, educated them, equipped them, and today it gives them seats of honor at the greatest festival of the year. The gesture is not charity. It is a statement about what Athens believes it owes its dead and what it expects from its living. These boys, watching a playwright stage the wars their fathers fought, are being shaped into the next generation of citizens. The theater is not separate from the civic project. It is the civic project. Behind them, while moving through the crowd with wine jars balanced on his shoulders, is a man whose name no record preserves. He is a slave. He is also, in ways the Athenians rarely examined directly, one of the builders of this city. The marble on the hill above, quarried, hauled, cut, lifted into place, was worked in large part by men like him. The silver that funded the fleet that saved Greece at Salamis came from mines at Laurion, worked by slaves in conditions that killed them. The leisure that allowed free Athenian men to spend their days in philosophical debate and their mornings at the theater was purchased, directly and deliberately, by the labor of people who had no political existence whatsoever. Athens held this contradiction inside itself and never resolved it. The city that invented the concept of the free citizen owned human beings as property. Both of these things were completely, simultaneously true. Up in the seating, near the judges who will decide today's competition, there is a playwright. He is older now, in his 60s, with the build of a man who spent his youth as a soldier. He was at Marathon. He stood on that coastal plain in 490 BCE when 10,000 Athenians faced the Persian Empire and, against every reasonable calculation, won. He watched men he knew die on the beach. He also watched something else that day, watched what it looked like when free men chose to fight rather than being driven into battle by officers with whips. He's been writing about it ever since, not just about Marathon, about what it means to act, to choose, to suffer consequences, to stand before forces larger than yourself and decide who you are. He calls this form tragedy. He invented it, or close enough. His name is Aeschylus, and the play about to be performed was written by him, and it will be watched by the men who lived the events it depicts, and some of them will weep. And this too is an invention, the idea that a city should sit together and feel things collectively, should process its wars and its griefs and its moral failures through the controlled, deliberate, devastating machinery of art. Above all of them, on the hill, the Parthenon catches the early light. It is not finished yet. The scaffolding is still up on the eastern end, the sculptors still working, but enough of it stands to be understood. The columns are Doric, massive, carved from Pentelic marble hauled 10 miles from the quarry. They are not perfectly straight. They are built with a slight inward curve, a barely perceptible taper, calculated so precisely that if extended into the sky, they would meet at a point more than a mile above the earth. The curve exists because a perfectly straight column looks to the human eye as though it bows outward. The Athenians knew this and corrected for it. They built an illusion of perfection by bending reality. Inside, a statue of Athena stands 40 feet tall, made of gold and ivory, holding a small winged victory in her outstretched hand. The building has not been equaled in 2,500 years. It will still be standing, damaged, stripped, converted into a mosque, partially exploded by a Venetian cannonball, when every other structure built in this era has returned to dust. This is one morning, one festival, one city, and everything in it, the shard of pottery, the barefoot philosopher, the war orphan in his dead father's armor, the playwright who turned battle into art, the building on the hill that bends geometry to its will. Every single thing in this scene is an invention. Democracy, tragedy, philosophy, the examined life, the jury trial, the concept of the citizen, the idea that beauty should be mathematically precise and humanly felt at the same time. The idea that power should answer to the people who live under it. Athens did not inherit these things. Athens made them. This city, 4 square miles of rocky limestone, no great river, no agricultural abundance, no natural geography of empire, assembled the operating system the Western world still runs on. It did this inside roughly one human lifetime. As between the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE and the execution of Socrates in 399 BCE, 91 years, the span of a long life. The question the next hours will answer goes beyond what Athens produced. We would dig deeper into what that production actually looked like from the inside. The mechanics of it, the contradictions inside it, the specific people who built it, and the specific costs they paid and imposed. Democracy is a word everyone knows. The Parthenon is an image everyone has seen. Socrates is a name everyone has heard. What lives beneath the words and the images and the names, that is what this is about. The seats are full now. The herald is speaking. The crowd goes quiet. It begins. Before Athens became Athens, it was something much smaller and much darker. Strip away the Parthenon, the philosophy, the democracy, the theater. Strip away the name itself, the mythology of the thing. And what you find underneath is a city that, for most of its early existence, was governed by fear, debt, and the concentrated power of a handful of aristocratic families who had held the land for generations and intended to keep holding it. The Athens that would eventually produce Socrates and Sophocles and the most radical political experiment the ancient world had ever seen began as a Mycenaean fortress on a rocky hill, a stronghold. A place where a king and his warriors sat above the plain and controlled what happened below. The Acropolis, the sacred rock, the flat-topped limestone outcrop that rises 150 meters above the city basin, was not always a temple complex. Long before the Parthenon, it was a palace. In the Bronze Age, the Mycenaean rulers of Athens lived on the summit behind massive stone walls, the kind of walls later Greeks would look at and call Cyclopean, believing no human hands could have built them, that only giants could have moved stones that large. The walls were real. The giants were not. But the awe was genuine. The Acropolis had been a seat of power for 1,000 years before a single column of the Parthenon was quarried. What surrounded it in those early centuries was not a city in any sense we would recognize, but it was a collection of villages, farms, olive groves, and workshops spread across the plain of Attica, a region of roughly 1,000 square miles of rocky, semi-arid land projecting into the Aegean. Attica had silver in its hills and clay along its riverbeds and access to the sea, but its soil was thin and its rainfall unreliable. It could not feed a great population from its own agriculture. Whatever Athens would become, it would not become it by farming. The geography was pointing elsewhere from the beginning, toward trade, toward the sea, toward the kind of city that lives by its wits rather than its harvests. By the 8th century BCE, Athens had consolidated into something recognizable as a polis, a city-state, the defining political unit of the Greek world. The polis was not merely a city. Only it was a community of citizens bound to a shared set of laws, religious practices, and obligations, with a physical center and a surrounding territory. Athens's territory was all of Attica, which made it unusually large by Greek standards. Most polis were tiny, governing a town and a few miles of farmland. Athens governed a peninsula. That scale would matter enormously later. For now, what mattered was who controlled it. The answer was the Eupatridae, the well-born, the hereditary aristocracy who held the best land, controlled access to the courts, monopolized the priesthoods, and filled every office of government by birthright. Athens in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE was an oligarchy in the precise sense, power held by the few, inherited rather than earned, defended by custom and by force. The poor farmed on terms set by the rich. Debt was the mechanism of control. A man who could not pay his debts could be, and regularly was, enslaved, not metaphorically, literally. Athenian citizens were sold into slavery by other Athenian citizens as legal punishment for unpaid obligations. Families were broken apart. People who had farmed the same land for generations found themselves owned by the men who had lent them money to survive a bad harvest. The system was self-reinforcing and brutal, and it had been running for a long time. Then came Draco. In 621 BCE, Athens appointed a man named Draco to codify the city's laws for the first time. Before Draco, Athenian law existed as custom, oral tradition, aristocratic precedent, the judgment of men who happened to hold power. Draco wrote it down. This was itself a significant act. Written law, visible to all, theoretically applies equally to all. The problem was what Draco wrote. His code was famous in antiquity not for its justice, but for its severity. Nearly every offense carried the death penalty. Steal a cabbage, death. Be caught idle, death. The ancient sources report that when asked why he had assigned death to so many crimes, Draco replied that small offenses deserved death and he could think of no harsher punishment for greater ones. A later Athenian orator said Draco's laws were written not in ink but in blood. His name entered the language. 2,500 years later, we still call a law unnecessarily harsh a draconian law. His actual legal code did not survive. His adjective did. Draco's laws did not solve Athens' social crisis, they formalized it. The underlying tension, land concentration, debt bondage, the grinding subordination of the poor to the rich, continued to build until, by the early 6th century, Athens was close to open civil war. The poor wanted land redistribution. The rich wanted to maintain their holdings. Both sides were arming. The city needed someone who could stand between them without being destroyed by either. They found Solon. In 594 BCE, Athens appointed Solon as archon, chief magistrate, and gave him extraordinary powers to reform the constitution. Solon was an unusual figure, a merchant and poet from a noble family who had lost his fortune and made it back through trade, a man with aristocratic connections who had also lived close enough to poverty to understand what debt bondage actually meant. He was trusted, improbably, by both sides. Well, he used that trust to do something neither side had asked for and neither fully wanted. His first act was the saisaktheia, the shaking off of burdens. He canceled all existing debts. Every Athenian who had been enslaved for debt was freed. Every Athenian land plot that had been mortgaged was returned to its owner. The stone markers that stood in the fields recording debt obligations were pulled up and destroyed. Solon later wrote that he had gone across Attica removing those stones and that the earth had witnessed his work. It was the most sweeping economic amnesty in the ancient Greek world. The rich were furious. The poor expected more. They wanted full land redistribution, the breaking up of the great estates. And when they did not get it, they were disappointed. Solon satisfied no one completely, or which he later described as the proof that he had done the right thing. He did not stop at debt cancellation. He restructured Athenian society from the ground up. He divided citizens into 4 classes based on agricultural income rather than birth, for the first time making wealth, not ancestry, the qualification for political participation. The poorest class, the Thetes, received the right to vote in the assembly and sit on juries. They could not yet hold high office, but they could participate in the institutions that held power accountable. It was a crack in the aristocratic monopoly, not a demolition, but a crack. He reformed the courts. He established the right of any citizen to bring a legal case on behalf of another. The radical idea that an injury to one Athenian was the business of all Athenians, not just the injured party. He created a council of 400 to prepare legislation for the assembly. He banned the export of agricultural products except olive oil, protecting the Athenian food supply and developing local industry. He encouraged skilled craftsmen from other Greek cities to immigrate to Athens by offering them citizenship, an early and deliberate policy of attracting talent from outside. Solon's reforms did not produce democracy. They produced the conditions in which democracy became possible. The distinction matters. What Solon built was a more open oligarchy, power still concentrated in the upper classes, but with new channels through which lower-class citizens could participate, new protections against the worst abuses, new institutions that could be used by future reformers as leverage. He laid pipe. Someone else would turn on the water. Why, after Solon came a period of renewed instability. The aristocratic factions resumed their fighting. A populist strongman named Pisistratos seized power 3 times, twice expelled, returning each time with mercenaries and allies, and eventually ruled Athens as tyrant for the better part of 2 decades. Pisistratos was not a bad ruler by ancient standards. He maintained Solon's laws, promoted trade, sponsored the arts, began the first serious building program on the Acropolis, and kept the peace. His sons inherited his position and governed after him. But tyranny is tyranny regardless of its quality, and the aristocratic families who had been frozen out of power during Pisistratos' reign had not forgotten what power felt like. The family that mattered most was the Alcmaeonids. They had been exiled by Pisistratos, and they wanted back in. Their most important member was a man named Cleisthenes, and in 510 BCE, with Spartan military help arranged through the oracle at Delphi, the Alcmaeonids had quietly bribed the oracle to tell every Spartan who came to consult it that Sparta should liberate Athens. The tyranny of the Pisistratids was overthrown. Hippias, the last of Pisistratos' sons, was driven into exile. Athens was free of its tyrant. What followed was not democracy. What followed was a power struggle between the leading aristocratic families for control of the now open city. Cleisthenes and his Alcmaeonid faction were in competition with another noble faction led by a man named Isagoras. Isagoras won the archonship. Cleisthenes was losing. And then Cleisthenes did something that had never been done before in Greek politics. He appealed directly to the people, not to the aristocrats, not to the traditional power brokers, to the demos, the ordinary citizens, the farmers, the craftsmen, the merchants, the men who had no hereditary claim to power and had always been governed rather than governing. Cleisthenes offered them a deal. Support me, and I will give you a direct role in the government of Athens. He was not driven by ideology. He was driven by the need to win a factional fight. He needed the people because the people were the only political force large enough to outweigh the aristocratic faction aligned against him. He mobilized the demos as a political weapon and, in doing so, accidentally invented democracy. What he actually built between 508 and 507 BCE was a complete restructuring of Athenian political organization. He abolished the old four Ionic tribes, clan-based groupings that the aristocracy had long used to maintain social control, and replaced them with 10 new tribes, each constructed artificially to mix citizens from different regions of Attica, the coast, the inland areas, and the city itself. The mixing was deliberate. A man's new tribal affiliation cut across his old regional and clan loyalties, binding him instead to Athenians he had never met, from parts of Attica he had never visited. It was social engineering of a remarkable sophistication. Cleisthenes was breaking up the networks through which aristocratic power reproduced itself. Each new tribe sent 50 representatives to a new council of 500, the boule, that would prepare legislation for the popular assembly. Offices were distributed among the tribes, rotating regularly. The assembly, the ecclesia, was open to all male citizens regardless of class. And for the first time in any political system anywhere in the recorded world, the ordinary male citizen had not merely a voice in his city's government, but a genuine, structural, legally protected role in it. The word the Athenians used for this system was demokratia, demos, the people, kratos, power, the power of the people. They invented the word along with the thing it described. Cleisthenes won his factional fight, as Agora, backed by Spartan troops, tried to dissolve the new council and restore the old order. The Athenian people rose up and besieged the Spartans on the Acropolis until they surrendered and left. This is the moment, not a vote, not a proclamation, but a siege in which Athenian democracy first defended itself. The people had been given a stake in the system, and when that system was threatened, they fought for it. Stand in the Agora for a moment and take stock of what Athens now is in 507 BCE. The Acropolis still rises above, still crowned with temples, still the sacred heart of the city. Below it, the Agora, the open space that functions as marketplace, civic center, and philosophical forum simultaneously, is busy with the commerce and argument of a mid-sized Greek city. Piraeus, the port 3 miles to the southwest, connects Athens to the Aegean and through it to the wider Mediterranean world. The silver mines at Laurion, in the southeastern tip of Attica, are producing revenue that has not yet been fully exploited. The population of Attica is somewhere between 150,000 and 300,000 people, of whom adult male citizens, the ones who can vote, number perhaps 30,000 to 40,000. It is not yet a great city. It is not yet the school of Greece. It has a new political system that most of its neighbors regard with a mixture of bafflement and suspicion. Sparta, the dominant military power in Greece, views Athenian democracy as an unstable experiment likely to collapse into tyranny or mob rule. Persia, the greatest empire in the world, has not yet focused its attention this far west. Both of them are about to. The experiment has been designed. The lab is ready. What happens next will determine whether it survives long enough to produce anything worth remembering. 40 years after Cleisthenes invented democracy, the Persian Empire came to destroy Athens. Twice. The first time, Athens turned it back on a coastal plain called Marathon, outnumbered, fighting alone, winning in a single afternoon. The second time, there was no stopping it on land. The Athenians made the only decision available to them. They abandoned their city entirely. Every man, woman, and child evacuated to the sea while the Persian army marched in, climbed the Acropolis, and burned everything on it to the ground. The sacred temples, the ancient olive groves, the homes of 3 centuries. Ash. The Athenians watched the smoke rise from ships offshore and waited. They fought back at sea, in a narrow strait where Persian numbers became a liability rather than an advantage. The Persian navy broke. The invasion collapsed. Athens came home to rubble. What they returned to was not a city, but the skeleton of one. The walls, the street grid, the harbor, the memory of what had stood there. They began rebuilding immediately, not to recover what they had lost, but to build something that had never existed. The city that came back to those burned foundations was harder than the one that had left. It was now the dominant naval power in the Aegean, flush with silver from its mines and tribute from a vast alliance of Greek states whose treasury would soon become Athenian. The destruction had not broken Athens. It had compressed it, the way pressure compresses coal, and what came out the other side was burning with an energy the next 50 years would spend in every direction at once. The generation that rebuilt Athens was the generation that built everything else. The Parthenon, the democracy in its fullest form, the theater, the philosophy, all of it built on ground that had been burned clean by people who had already lost everything once and chosen to come back anyway. Before we follow what Athens produced, we need to walk through what Athens was, not the idea of it, the physical, breathing, argumentative, chaotic, fragrant, noisy thing itself. Because the philosophy and the theater and the democracy did not float above the city in some elevated realm of pure thought. They grew out of its streets and its households and its daily rhythms the way everything grows, rooted, particular, smelling of fish and olive oil and the smoke of sacrificial fires. Start at sunrise. The streets of Athens in the 5th century BCE are narrow, unpaved, and not organized in any plan a Roman city planner would recognize. Athens is not a grid. It is an accumulation, centuries of paths beaten between houses and workshops and temples, widening where traffic demanded it and contracting into alleys where it didn't, with the Panathenaic Way, the main processional road, cutting through it all in a ceremonial straight line toward the Acropolis. The houses that line these streets are modest by any reckoning. The Athenians who built the Parthenon lived, most of them, in homes of mud brick with tiled roofs, a central courtyard open to the sky, and rooms arranged around it for sleeping, storage, and the women's work. The furniture inside is minimal: a bed, a storage chest, a few ceramic vessels. Compared to the grand public buildings, the private houses are almost aggressively plain. The Athenians spent their money and their care on what belonged to everyone. The city wakes fast. By the time the sun is fully up, the Agora, the large open space northwest of the Acropolis, is already loud. The Agora is not, in the modern sense, a square. It is not a park. It is not a marketplace in the narrow commercial sense, though commerce happens there. It is something that modern cities have almost entirely lost, a space where everything happens at once, where you might buy a fish at one end and argue a legal case at the other and catch a philosopher in the middle and watch a religious procession pass through while a herald announces the day's assembly agenda, and two men in a corner argue about the recent vote on the grain supply. All of this simultaneously, in the open air, with no separation between domains. Commerce and law and religion and politics and philosophy are not different activities conducted in different buildings in Athens. They are different textures of the same continuous public life, and the Agora is where that life concentrates. The stalls arrive at dawn. Fish sellers from Piraeus set up near the Water Commission buildings. Olive oil, cheese, bread, garlic, onions, and figs spread across wooden tables. Neat potters display their red figure ware. The vessels painted with the images of athletes and gods and symposium scenes that will eventually fill the museums of the modern world. Bronze workers, leather workers, and sellers of sandals, lamps, and iron tools occupy the periphery. The prices are haggled over loudly. The weights and measures are checked by a city official whose whole job is to stand in the Agora and verify that nobody is cheating on the scales. Then the legal business begins. Athens is a city of extraordinary litigiousness. The Athenians sue each other constantly over property boundaries, inheritance disputes, contract failures, slander, assault, unpaid debts. The courts that ring the Agora fill with juries of ordinary citizens who have reported at dawn to find out if they have been selected for today's cases. A complex mechanical device, the clariterion, a bronze tablet with slots for citizen identification tokens, randomizes the selection and assigns jurors to courts. The device is beautiful in its ingenuity and its purpose. It exists specifically to make bribery impractical. You cannot bribe a juror you don't know will be selected until the morning of the trial. And then, threading through all of it, The fish sellers and the jurors and the men arguing about the grain vote is the figure that Xenophon describes in precise detail. Socrates, present every day from early morning, moving through the walkways and gymnasia, appearing in the Agora as it fills, placing himself wherever the most people were. Working. Socrates used the Agora the way a musician uses a concert hall. It was his instrument. Or citizens who had abandoned military service, shown cowardice in battle, or mistreated their parents were forbidden from entering the Agora. The exclusion was not incidental. The Agora was not neutral commercial space. It was civic space, and civic space had conditions. To be in it was to be recognized as a participant in the life of the city. To be barred from it was to be barred from the city itself. By mid-morning, the heat is building. This is a Mediterranean city in a climate that runs warm for most of the year, and the Agora begins to thin. Men return to their work or their homes for the midday meal, which is light: bread, olives, onions, and cheese, or whatever the household's resources allow. The main meal of the day comes in the evening, after the baths. The diet of most Athenians is almost vegetarian by necessity and inclination. Meat is expensive and reserved for festivals, when animals are sacrificed to the gods, and the flesh is distributed to the people afterward. Fish is the protein of daily life, especially the salted fish that arrives preserved from the Black Sea coast. Wine is drunk with every meal, always diluted with water. Drinking undiluted wine is what barbarians do, and the Athenians are not barbarians. The gymnasium is the other great institution of Athenian public life, and it is worth dwelling on because it is easy to misread from the outside. 3 major gymnasia stand outside the city walls: the Academy, the Lyceum, and the Cynosarges, and they are not simply athletic facilities. They are, increasingly, the places where intellectual life happens alongside physical life, where the mind and the body are developed in the same space on the assumption that they are not separate projects. The word paideia, education, the formation of a human being, encompasses both. An Athenian boy's formal education divides cleanly into 2 streams: mousik, the cultivation of the mind through music, poetry, and letters, and gymnastic, the cultivation of the body through wrestling, running, and the athletic disciplines that are simultaneously training for war and training for life. Neither stream is considered more important than the other. Both are required. The Athenian ideal is the man who is beautiful and good, kalos kagathos, in the full sense, which means physically capable, intellectually developed, and morally serious, all 3 together. A boy's education begins around 7. He is handed over by his family to a paidagogos, usually a trusted slave, an older man whose job is not to teach but to escort the boy to his teachers and oversee his conduct. The grammatistes teaches reading, writing, and arithmetic. The kitharistes teaches lyre playing and singing. Music is not an extra, an elective, a luxury. It is the medium through which poetry is transmitted, and poetry is the medium through which moral and civic values are transmitted. Homer is the curriculum. Every Athenian boy of means knows the Iliad and the Odyssey the way the children of a later civilization know the Bible, as the foundational text that organizes what the world is and how a human being is supposed to move through it. Then the Paedo tribes, the physical trainer who oversees the wrestling, the running, the throwing of the discus, and the javelin. The gymnasium is his domain. By the time an Athenian boy becomes an ephebe, a young man entering military training at 18, his body and his mind have been worked on simultaneously for a decade. This education is not available to everyone. It costs money. The son of a poor citizen learns his trade from his father and develops his body through the work his poverty requires. The son of a slave learns nothing formally. The daughter of even a wealthy citizen learns what her mother can teach her: weaving, the management of the household, the domestic religious rituals that are her domain, and almost nothing more. The education that produces the citizens who argue in the assembly and the young men who follow Socrates through the Agora is an education for a specific slice of Athenian society. Now enter the household, because half of Athens lives inside it and rarely leaves. The oikos, the household, is the other world. Where the Agora is the domain of men, the oikos is the domain of women, and the boundary between them is one of the most absolute in Athenian life. A citizen woman of respectable family moves between these two worlds almost exclusively at the direction of necessity or ritual, to fetch water from the public fountain, to attend a religious festival, to mourn at a funeral. Her daily life is the management of the household, the food, the clothing, the slaves, the children, the complex domestic economy of a pre-industrial urban household that produces much of what it consumes. She spins and weaves. She supervises the household slaves. She manages the storage of food and oil and wine. She raises the children until the boys are old enough for their paedagogos. The house is divided. The men's quarters, the andron, face the entrance. The women's quarters, the gynekonitis, are at the rear, as far from the door as possible. When male visitors come, the women withdraw. This is not, in the context of 5th century Athens, experienced as unusual. It is the architecture of a world where the separation of male and female public life is so complete that the house itself is organized around maintaining it. But the picture of total confinement is not entirely accurate. Thus, and the nuances matter. Wealthy women are, paradoxically, more confined than poor ones, because they can afford to be, and because their confinement is a mark of their family's status. The wife of a poor citizen has no choice but to go to the fountain herself, to shop in the market, to move through the city as her household requires. The wife of a wealthy man sends a slave for the water and another to the market. Her seclusion is her husband's display of prosperity. And in the space of religion, the boundary softens. Religion is the one domain where Athenian women move publicly, with authority, in ways the city acknowledges and requires. The Thesmophoria, 3 days every autumn, a festival of Demeter conducted entirely by married citizen women, with no male presence permitted, is one of the most important religious events in the Athenian calendar. What happens during those 3 days is largely unknown because men were excluded and no woman wrote it down. The Araphoria, the Broronia, the Plinteria, festival after festival in the Athenian religious calendar requires the participation of women, sometimes exclusively. The girls who carry the sacred baskets in the Panathenaic procession must be virgins of good family. To refuse a girl's selection was to question her family's honor publicly. Every year, selected noble women spend months weaving the peplos, the great robe that will be presented to the statue of Athena on the Acropolis. The city that denies women a political voice has built its most sacred religious practices around the labor of women's hands. The most remarkable exception to every rule that governed Athenian women's lives is a woman named Aspasia of Miletus. She was not Athenian. She came from Miletus on the coast of Asia Minor, which meant she was a metic, a resident foreigner, and was therefore exempt from the conventions that bound citizen wives. She came to Athens sometime in the 450s BCE and became the companion of Pericles, who divorced his Athenian wife to live with her. She ran what some contemporaries described as a salon, a gathering place for the most important minds in Athens, and others described with hostility as something more disreputable, which tells you less about what it was than about how uncomfortable her existence made those around her. Socrates visited. So did the sculptor Phidias. So did politicians and philosophers and military men. Now Plato puts words in her mouth in the Menexenus, a speech on the nature of civic virtue, and whether or not she actually delivered anything like it, the fact that Plato found it plausible to imagine her doing so is itself extraordinary. Aristophanes mocked her in his comedies, which is its own form of acknowledgement. You mock what you take seriously. She could not be a citizen. She could not vote. She could not own land. She appears in the record almost entirely through the eyes of men who were alternately fascinated and threatened by her. But she was there, in the most intellectually alive city in the world, at its most luminous moment, arguing and thinking and influencing the man who ran it. Her presence is a reminder that the city Athens claimed to be, the education of Greece, why the city that valued mind and argument above all else, contained within its own walls people whose minds were as capable as any citizens and who were structurally barred from using them on equal terms. Now the evening comes, and for those who can afford it, the city's social life shifts into a space that no daytime institution quite matches. The symposium. The word means drinking together, and at its most basic level, that is what it is. Men reclining on cushioned couches arranged around the walls of a private room, the andron, drinking wine mixed with water and talking through the night. But to call the symposium a drinking party is to miss everything that made it central to Athenian intellectual life. It is the space where the ideas that move through the Agora by day are tested and refined and extended at night. Where political alliances are built and broken. Where poetry is performed and debated. Where the questions Socrates raises in the street are taken inside and pursued past midnight by men who have the leisure and the education to pursue them. The evening might open with a libation to the gods and a hymn. Then conversation, which could be anything, and generally was. The participants in Plato's symposium spend an evening delivering speeches on the nature of love, each one trying to outdo the last, until Socrates delivers what he presents as the account Diotima of Mantinea gave him, a woman again, whose wisdom Socrates attributes as the source of his own deepest understanding of Eros. In Xenophon's version, the same setting produces a discussion of what each man considers his most valuable possession. One says his wealth, another says his friends, a third says his physical beauty. The discussion is playful and then suddenly serious, the way good conversation is. Poetry is performed. The lyric poets, Pindar and Simonides and Anacreon, sung to the lyre. Riddles are posed, a game called Cottabos is played. There's in which the drinkers flick the last drops of wine from their cups at a target across the room, the kind of game that makes sense only after several rounds of the crater. The evening sometimes moves into the street, the symposiasts processing in a loud and disheveled group, the komos, through the night city, singing and stumbling and occasionally knocking on doors, to the exasperation of neighbors who have already gone to bed. What moves through these evenings, from house to house, from the conversation of one evening to the letter a participant writes the next morning to a friend in another city, is the intellectual life of Athens. The symposium is how ideas travel in a city without newspapers or universities. A position developed in one andron will be tested in another the following week and refined in a third the week after that. Socrates moves between these rooms as he moves through the Agora, talking, questioning, refusing to let a comfortable answer rest. The democracy runs on argument in the assembly. The theater runs on argument on the stage. The symposium runs on argument around the wine. The Athenian is a person shaped by multiple overlapping institutions, all of which require him to think on his feet and defend what he believes. But only him. The symposium admits the male citizen and his invited male guests. The only women in the room are the hetaerai, educated companions, women of foreign birth or freed slave status, trained in music and conversation and the performance of presence, whose position in Athenian society occupies a strange middle ground between social acceptance and complete exclusion from civic life. They are permitted in the spaces where citizen wives are not, because they do not need to be protected. Or more precisely, they have no honor in the civic sense to protect, and so the rules that govern citizen women's seclusion do not apply to them. This is Athens, the city that produced the most sophisticated conversation about justice that the ancient world had ever seen, conducted in rooms from which most of its inhabitants were excluded. But the city does not know this yet, not as a problem. It knows it as structure, as the way things are. The agora and the gymnasium and the assembly and the symposium, all of it is designed to produce a particular kind of human being, and that human being is the Athenian male citizen. Everything else, the women managing the oikos, the medics running the workshops and banking houses and schools, the slaves whose labor makes all of it possible, is the infrastructure on which the citizen stands. He does not, for the most part, see it as infrastructure. He sees it as the natural order of things, what he builds on it. The theater, the philosophy, the democracy, the Parthenon is real. The gold is real even if the foundations are hidden. That tension between the gold and the foundations is the story Athens has not yet been forced to confront. It is coming. It is March in Athens. The courts are closed. The prisons have released their inmates for the day. The harbor at Piraeus has gone quiet. Shops are shuttered. The city has, by collective agreement, stopped. Everyone is going to the theater. They come down from the hills and up from the port and in through the city gates, tens of thousands of them, moving toward the southern slope of the Acropolis, where the Theater of Dionysus has been carved into the rock. They carry food and wine and cushions for the stone seats. Some have been here since before sunrise, holding places for friends or family. The wealthy have their own cushioned seats near the front. Everyone else fills in behind, row after row, rising up the hillside until the theater holds 15,000 people in a single curved limestone bowl, all of them facing the circular stage below. This will go on for 5 days. 3 playwrights are competing. Each has submitted 3 tragedies and a comic piece. The judges, 10 men chosen by lot, 1 from each Athenian tribe, sworn to impartiality, sit in marble thrones in the front row. In the rows directly behind them sit the war orphans, boys whose fathers died fighting for Athens, raised at public expense, given their armor by the city on the day they came of age, and given these seats, the best seats in Athens, in front of the judges, in front of everyone, as the city's permanent acknowledgement of what their fathers were worth. The herald speaks, the procession ends, the first play begins. What happens next, what Athens invented here in this bowl on these days, changed the way human beings understood themselves. Not because the plays were beautiful, though they were, because they were honest in a way that nothing before them had been. A man walks onto the stage. He is the king of Thebes. He has done everything right, been careful, been moral, been conscientious. He's avoided every trap the oracle warned him about. He's about to discover that he murdered his father at a crossroads 20 years ago without knowing it was his father, and that the woman he has loved and lived with and had children with is his mother. He did not know. He could not have known. He tried specifically not to do these things and did them anyway. The audience watching him knows what is coming before he does, and they cannot stop it, and neither can he. This is Sophocles. This is Oedipus Rex. And the question it is asking, not stating, not lecturing, asking, is one that no political speech, no philosophical treatise, no religious ceremony had ever asked with this kind of force. What do we owe a person destroyed by facts they could not have known? What is justice when knowledge arrives too late to save the person who needed it? The audience does not discuss this question afterward in the way you would discuss a lecture. They carry it home in their bodies. Aristotle would later describe what tragedy does to an audience as catharsis, a purging, a cleansing of the emotions that had been built up and released. But the more precise thing is that they left the theater having felt something they could not unfeel, having understood something about the gap between intention and consequence that no argument could have given them. The play had opened them. The next morning, a different playwright, a different set of questions. Aeschylus, older than Sophocles, what a veteran of Marathon who had watched the Persian army he helped defeat become the subject of his first surviving play, had already changed tragedy structurally in a way that made everything else possible. Before him, a single actor spoke to a chorus. Aeschylus added a second actor, and suddenly 2 people could disagree on stage, 2 positions could collide. Conflict, genuine unresolved conflict between people who both had claims, became the engine of the form. His Oresteia follows a man who murders his mother to avenge his father, who was murdered by the mother. Every act of revenge is also an act of murder. Every justice creates a new injustice. The trilogy ends not with a verdict, but with an institution, Athena founding the court of the Areopagus as the only mechanism capable of breaking the cycle of blood violence. The invention of law as the alternative to revenge. Aeschylus wrote this while Athens was actively debating the actual powers of the actual Areopagus. The audience watching his trilogy was also voting on it. Then, Euripides, who arrived last and was understood least and whose work would travel furthest. His Medea walks onto the stage and tells the audience in plain language that she is going to kill her children. She does not want to kill her children. She loves her children. She's going to kill them because their father, who has abandoned her and their family for a politically advantageous marriage, must be made to feel what she has felt. The audience watches her argue with herself, watches the love and the rage occupy the same mind at the same time, neither winning cleanly. The resolution arriving not as triumph, but as the terrible simplification of a person pushed past the point where complexity is survivable. The audience watching Medea in 431 BCE was, in most cases, watching a woman think and feel and decide in a way that no representation of a woman had ever asked them to observe before. Euripides was booed regularly. He won the dramatic competition only 5 times in his career. He was also the most performed playwright in the ancient world within a generation of his death, because what he had found inside the human mind was too recognizable to dismiss. After 3 days of tragedy, the festival shifts. The satyr plays arrive, short, obscene, violent, farcical pieces in which a chorus of half-man, half-goat creatures stumble through mythological plots involving drunkenness, lust, and slapstick humiliation. The audience, which has spent 3 days being broken open by grief and terror and moral vertigo, now roars with laughter. This shift was not accidental, it was structural. Athens built the emotional release valve directly into the festival's architecture because the people who designed this institution understood, before anyone had theorized it, that a city cannot live in a permanent state of tragic recognition. You crack them open, and then you give them somewhere to go. The whole festival was free. The state paid the entrance fee for citizens who could not afford it. Nobody was excluded. And the deliberate mixing, wealthy and poor, powerful and ordinary, all sitting in the same bowl watching the same plays, reacting together, judging together, was the point. Athens was conducting, 5 days every spring, a collective exercise in the examined conscience. A city asking itself, through the controlled machinery of art, what it actually believed and whether those beliefs held together under pressure. Step out of the theater now and walk down the slope toward the Agora. It is a morning in the 440s BCE, and the open space below the Acropolis is already loud. Merchants are selling fish and olive oil and bronze tools. 2 men are arguing a property dispute in front of a magistrate. A group of young men are wrestling in the dust near the gymnasium colonnade. Somewhere near the Stoa of Zeus, a group has formed around a short, heavy, ugly man who is barefoot despite the cold and who appears to be in the middle of an argument he is enjoying considerably more than the person he is arguing with. The man's name is Socrates. But he is perhaps 50 years old. He has no income, no official position, no written work. He owns, as far as anyone can tell, almost nothing. He is, by common agreement among those who know him, the most dangerous conversationalist in Athens. A general has stopped to speak with him on his way to the courts. The general has a reputation for sound judgment. Everyone respects him. Socrates expresses admiration for this. The general's wisdom is well known, he says, and Socrates himself knows nothing, so perhaps the general might help him understand something he has been puzzling over. What is courage? Surely a man who has led armies in battle understands courage better than anyone. The general gives the obvious answer: courage is standing your ground against the enemy. Socrates thanks him warmly and asks a small clarifying question. What about a soldier who retreats in order to regroup and fight more effectively? Is that not also courageous? The general agrees and revises his definition. Socrates thanks him again and asks another question, and another. Each question is gentle, even admiring. Each one cuts a millimeter deeper. 20 minutes later, the general has given 5 different definitions of courage, each of which has collapsed under a single follow-up question. He is not stupid. He is a decorated commander who has spent his adult life practicing the very thing he cannot now define. And he cannot define it. The definition he arrived at the court with, solid, obvious, unquestioned, has dissolved in the Athenian morning, leaving in its place a sensation that Plato's dialogues return to again and again, the strange, uncomfortable, The oddly exhilarating feeling of realizing that you do not know what you thought you knew. The general makes an excuse and leaves. The young men who were watching move closer. This is what Socrates did every day. He called it midwifery, helping people give birth to the ideas already inside them by asking the right questions in the right order. He insisted he knew nothing himself, that his only advantage was knowing the extent of his ignorance while others did not know theirs. The oracle at Delphi had declared him the wisest man in Athens, and he had spent years trying to prove the oracle wrong, questioning every man in the city who had a reputation for wisdom, the politicians, the poets, the generals, the craftsmen, and concluding each time that the oracle was technically correct. Not because Socrates knew anything, because unlike the men he questioned, he did not mistake his ignorance for knowledge. One evening during a military campaign, according to a story told by one of his admirers, Socrates stopped in the middle of an open field at sunrise, apparently absorbed in a problem. He stood there through the day, through the night, through the following sunrise, motionless, completely still, 24 hours in the same spot, working through something inside his head. When he finally moved, he greeted the sun and walked on. His fellow soldiers had watched him all night, some of them dragging their sleeping mats outside to observe the phenomenon. Nobody asked him what he had been thinking about. He would have only answered with a question. What he was building, in the streets, in the gymnasiums, outside the law courts, at dinner parties he hadn't been invited to, was not a philosophy in the institutional sense. There were no lectures, no texts, no school. What he was building was a practice, a daily discipline of examining the assumptions on which a life rested. The unexamined life is not worth living. This is the most famous thing he ever said, recorded by Plato at his trial, and it sounds like an aphorism, a bumper sticker for philosophy. In context, it is something harder. He was telling the jury that he would not stop doing what he did even if they freed him, that he would rather die than live without the examination, that the examination was not a hobby or a method or a career. It was the point. The young men who followed him everywhere, the wealthy, the talented, the restless, the ones who found conventional Athenian life insufficient, absorbed this and took it in different directions. Plato would systematize it into dialogues and then into metaphysics. Aristotle, Plato's student, would take it further into biology, logic, politics, and ethics. But what both of them started with was the specific, irreplaceable experience of watching Socrates dismantle certainty in the open air, for free, with nothing but questions. Walk further across the Agora. There is a man sitting under a colonnade with a scroll. His name is Herodotus. He is not Athenian. He was born in Halicarnassus on the coast of Asia Minor, but he has come to Athens because Athens in the 440s BCE is where the thinking is happening, and what he is working on requires the most rigorous thinking available. He's writing a history of the Persian Wars, not a chronicle, not a list of kings and battles, a history, an investigation, an inquiry into why things happened. His word for the project is historia, which means simply inquiry. The word history comes from it. Before Herodotus, events were recorded as divine will or royal achievement. Gods caused things, kings did things. The question of why, what combination of human decisions, material interests, cultural differences, and specific circumstances produced this outcome rather than that one, had not been formally asked. Herodotus asked it. He traveled to Egypt, to Persia, to the Black Sea coast, to the battlefields themselves, and he talked to people. He interviewed witnesses, he compared accounts, he recorded what multiple people said and noted where they disagreed, and often including versions he clearly disbelieved while naming his source. He was wrong about many things. He included legends he suspected were legends. But the method, go, look, ask, compare, reason, was entirely new. He was inventing the discipline on the page while practicing it. A generation later, Thucydides read Herodotus and found him insufficiently precise. Where Herodotus allowed for divine intervention and ethnographic digression and stories that might or might not be true, Thucydides stripped everything out. He was an Athenian general who had fought in the Peloponnesian War and been exiled for 20 years for a battlefield failure. which gave him, as he later noted with characteristic dryness, considerable time to travel to both sides of the conflict and conduct interviews. The history he wrote from those interviews is the most rigorous piece of political analysis produced in the ancient world. He identified the cause of the war in a single sentence: the growth of Athenian power and the alarm it inspired in Sparta made the conflict structurally inevitable. Not the specific incidents that triggered it, the structural forces underneath them. He was inventing political realism, the analysis of power as something that follows its own logic independent of morality or intention. 2,500 years before it became a formal discipline. His history is still assigned at military academies and in international relations programs today. One more figure, and then we can step back. He was not Athenian. He worked on an island called Kos off the coast of Asia Minor, in the intellectual orbit that Athens was generating across the Greek world. His name was Hippocrates, and the question he was asking was the most radical of all, because it was the most obvious. What if sickness had a natural cause? In the world Hippocrates was born into, illness was divine punishment. A god was angry. A demon had entered. The cure was sacrifice, prayer, ritual, the propitiation of whatever supernatural force had decided to afflict you. This was not stupidity. It was the logical response to the available evidence in a world with no germ theory, no understanding of infection, no anatomy beyond what could be observed on a battlefield wound. The framework was wrong, but it was not arbitrary. Hippocrates looked at the same evidence and drew a different conclusion. Disease came from natural causes, from what you ate, or from where you lived, the climate around you, the constitution of your particular body. The physician's job was not to pray, but to observe, to record symptoms, to track progression, to compare cases and reason from the pattern toward the cause. He described epilepsy, the sacred disease, so called because its sudden violent seizures seemed unmistakably supernatural, as a brain disorder with hereditary causes. He wrote, in language still startling in its directness, that anyone who called epilepsy sacred was using the word as a cover for ignorance. There is not a single mention of divine causation in the entirety of the Hippocratic corpus. A physician moving through his patients in the pre-dawn hours, recording what he saw, the color of the urine, the progression of the fever, for the day on which the crisis came, was doing something that had never been done. He was treating the human body as a natural system, subject to natural investigation, approachable through careful observation and rational analysis. He could not cure most of what he saw. 5th century medicine had no tools for that. But the move he made, from supernatural explanation to natural inquiry, is the founding move of all medicine that followed. First, do no harm. Observe before you act. Understand the natural process before you intervene in it. These instructions, in 400 BCE, were a revolution. Stand back now and take in what is accumulated. In the Theater of Dionysus, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides are staging the deepest moral questions a city can ask itself in front of the entire city every spring as a civic ritual. In the Agora, Socrates is dismantling certainty one conversation at a time, teaching Athens that the examined life is not a luxury but a necessity. At the Colonnade, Herodotus is inventing the discipline of asking why. Across the Aegean, Hippocrates is removing the gods from medicine and replacing them with observation. And none of these people know each other in the institutional sense. There is no school, no university, no coordinating body. What connects them is the city itself, its insistence on argument, its structural appetite for competing positions, its agora, where everything happened in the same open air. The democracy that required citizens to defend their views in the assembly trained an entire population in the discipline of thinking under pressure. The theater that asked 15,000 people to sit together with unresolvable moral questions trained them in the discipline of sitting with complexity. The courts that put decisions in the hands of juries of ordinary citizens trained them in the discipline of judgment. Athens did not produce these minds despite being a democracy. It produced them because of it. None of this happened by accident. The theater, the philosophy, the history, the medicine, none of it floated into existence because Athens was spiritually gifted or because the Aegean air carried something magical. What produced it was a machine, a specific, deliberately constructed political machine maintained by constant human effort that created the conditions in which this density of invention became possible. And to understand that machine, but you need to understand the man who brought it to its fullest form. His name was Pericles. He was not a king. He held no hereditary title, no permanent office, no throne. He was a strategos, a general, one of 10 elected annually by the Athenian assembly. And he won that election every single year for 30 consecutive years, not by inheriting power, not by seizing it, by standing before a room of free citizens and persuading them to keep choosing him 30 times. In a city where any citizen could challenge him, any orator could undermine him, any military failure could end him overnight. He held power through the instrument power was supposed to serve. What he ran was unlike anything that had existed before. Every male citizen of Athens, farmer, craftsman, sailor, the landless man who owned nothing but his vote, had the right to attend the ecclesia, the popular assembly, which met 40 times a year on the Pnyx, a hill just west of the Acropolis, not to observe, to speak, to vote. Any citizen could stand and address the assembly on any subject under discussion. The assembly declared war, made peace, passed laws, dispatched generals, and recalled them. It was the sovereign body of Athens, and its membership was the entire male citizen population. Most government offices were filled not by election, but by lot, by the drawing of names, random, deliberately random. The logic was explicit. Election favors the wealthy and well-connected whose names people know. The lot is genuinely equal. A man chosen by lot owes his position to chance, not to a network of obligation and favor. He serves 1 year. Cannot serve again in the same office. Returns to the citizen body when he is done. Power rotates through the population the way water moves through a wheel. The Boule, the Council of 500, prepared legislation, managed the city's administration, received foreign embassies. 500 members, 50 from each tribe chosen by lot, serving 1 year. A citizen could serve twice in his lifetime. In a city of 30 to 40,000 adult male citizens, the odds of serving at least once were substantial. Athens was not a city where a small class of professional politicians governed while everyone else watched. It was a city where governance was something that happened to you. Pericles took this and made it more radical still. He introduced pay for public service, jury duty, council membership, assembly attendance. Before this, only men who could afford to lose a day's work could afford to participate. The farmer who left his fields to sit in the assembly lost income he could not spare. Pericles put the state's money behind the principle that every citizen's voice was worth the same, and paid citizens to use it. The landless poor flooded into the institutions. The character of Athenian democracy changed permanently. The jury courts are worth a specific moment of attention because nothing quite like them had ever existed. A jury in Athens numbered 501 citizens, chosen by lot on the morning of the trial from a pool of 6,000 who had sworn the juror's oath at the start of the year. The number was odd to prevent ties. There was no judge, no professional legal authority presided over anything. The jury heard the case. He deliberated briefly and voted. The majority decided. There was no appeal above it, because there was nothing above it. The people were sovereign. The jury was the people. Defendants spoke for themselves, so did prosecutors. Speeches were timed by water clock. The jury of 500 ordinary citizens, farmers, sailors, leather workers, men who had spent their lives doing things entirely unrelated to the law, decided whether you lived or died. It was chaotic. It was magnificent. And it produced a population that understood in their bodies rather than in theory what it meant to administer justice. Now, look up. Above the city, on the flat top of the Acropolis, something is being built. The Persians burned the Acropolis in 480 BCE. For 30 years, the ruins sat untouched. A generation of Athenians grew up beneath the silhouette of their own wound. Then, Pericles decided to heal it, not restore it, surpass it. The building program he launched in the 440s BCE was funded largely with money from the Delian League, the alliance of Greek city-states whose pooled treasury was supposed to sit on the sacred island of Delos, held in common, available to all. Pericles moved it to Athens, and then he spent it on Athens. The allied cities sent tribute. Athens spent it on marble. The centerpiece was the Parthenon. Construction began in 447 BCE. 100,000 tons of marble quarried from Mount Pentelicon, 10 miles away, hauled up the Acropolis on sledges and wagons and the backs of men. 15 years of work. What the architects Ictinus and Callicrates built is technically a Doric temple. But calling the Parthenon a Doric temple is like calling the Iliad a poem about a war. The columns are not straight. They bulge slightly outward at the middle, because a perfectly straight column looks to the human eye as though it bows inward. The floor is not flat. It curves upward toward the center, so gently that if you extended the lines outward, they would meet at a point more than a mile above the building. The corner columns are slightly thicker than the others, because seen against open sky they appear thinner, and the builders compensated. None of this is visible to the naked eye. Standing before the Parthenon, you see none of the corrections. You see a building that looks perfect. You see perfection because the architects bent reality to produce the appearance of it, because they understood that the human eye does not see what is there, it sees what it expects to see. And they built a correction for that expectation into every single line. The Parthenon is not a perfect building. It is a building that calculated what perfection looks like to a human being standing in front of it and produced that. Inside stood Phidias's statue of Athena, 40 feet tall, gold and ivory. She held a small winged victory in her outstretched hand. Her reflection was visible from ships entering Piraeus 5 miles away. The building was a temple. It was also a treasury. It was also a message to every city-state that sent tribute to the Delian League and watched their money become this. Athens is what civilization looks like. This is what your tribute built. Athens is the center of the Greek world, and this is the proof. Pericles said all of this out loud in the most famous speech Athens ever produced. It was delivered at a state funeral in the winter of 431 BCE, the first year of the Peloponnesian War. Soldiers had died in the opening engagements. The custom required a public eulogy. Pericles stood before the assembled city and spoke, and what he said was not primarily about the dead. It was about what they had died for. Athens, he said, was an education to Greece. Its citizens combined public duty with private cultivation in a way no other people managed. Athenians discussed policy before acting, not because they believed words slowed deeds, but because they knew that acting without understanding was the greater danger. Athens opened its city to the world and hid nothing, not because Athens lacked secrets worth keeping, but because Athens' strength came from its character, not from concealment. Future generations, he said, would not need Homer to praise what Athens had achieved. The evidence would speak for itself. He was doing with words exactly what Phidias had done with marble, constructing a version of Athens so luminous that the people looking at it would feel something they could not unfeel. The machine Pericles built, the assembly, the lot, the paid participation, the rotating offices, the jury courts, the Parthenon, the empire that paid for all of it, was the most sophisticated political construction the ancient world had produced. It had flaws visible even from inside it. It ran on tribute that looked increasingly like extortion. It excluded most of the people living within its walls. It could be and was manipulated by skilled orators. Pericles himself held power for 30 years through a combination of genuine ability and political genius that was not always distinguishable from manipulation. But what it produced has not been matched since. The machine and its output were inseparable. You could not have had one without the other, and both of them, the machine and everything it generated, were, in the winter of 431 BCE, about to be tested in ways Pericles had not anticipated. The war had begun. The plague was coming. Before the war comes, before the plague comes, there is something that needs to be seen, something that was always there, underneath everything, underneath the theater and the philosophy and the Parthenon and the Funeral Oration, something the Athenians built into the foundation of their civilization and then, for the most part, declined to examine. Athens, the city that invented democracy, ran on slaves, not metaphorically, not as a minor footnote, as a structural fact as load-bearing as the columns of the Parthenon. At the height of the Golden Age, Athens held somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 enslaved people. In a total population of perhaps 300,000, 1 in 3 people in Attica was someone else's property. They built the Parthenon. They rowed the warships that won at Salamis. They worked the silver mines at Laurion, in shafts so narrow a man could not stand upright, in darkness lit only by oil lamps, breathing rock dust, and the silver that came out of those mines funded the fleet that saved Greece and the democracy that the fleet protected. They cooked the food, raised the children, managed the households that gave free men the leisure to sit in the assembly and debate the nature of justice. The leisure that produced the philosophy was purchased directly by the labor of people who had no access to the philosophy. Sit with that for a moment. Socrates walks the Agora asking free men what justice is. The man who carried his breakfast to him that morning is owned by the man who is now struggling to answer the question. The mines at Laurion are worth a specific moment of attention because they are the place where the contradiction becomes impossible to romanticize. The slaves who worked Laurion, tens of thousands of them, leased to private contractors by their owners at a daily rate, descended into tunnels sometimes less than a meter high, in shifts that lasted through the night, extracting silver ore by lamplight with iron picks. The ventilation was poor, the heat was brutal. The mortality was high enough that the workforce required constant replenishment through war captives and the slave markets of the Aegean. Thucydides records, almost in passing, that during the Peloponnesian War, more than 20,000 slaves escaped from Attica when the Spartans occupied the region, a number that suggests not only the scale of the enslaved population, but something about what they were running from. Some enslaved people in Athens had lives that were, by the standards of ancient slavery, relatively bearable. Household slaves participated in the rhythms of the family, were sometimes manumitted upon their owner's death, and in a few cases accumulated enough money through permitted small-scale trade to purchase their own freedom. A small number became skilled craftsmen or teachers or even bankers, operating with a degree of practical autonomy while remaining legally property. The city-owned slaves who served as Athens's police force, the Scythian archers who maintained order in the assembly, had a peculiar quasi-public status. None of this changes the fundamental fact. They were property. They could be sold, beaten, separated from their families at their owner's discretion, and killed, though killing a slave was technically illegal, and the law was enforced with varying enthusiasm. They could not vote, own land, bring legal cases, or leave, and the Athenians knew this. They were not unaware of what they were doing. They had philosophers who could analyze anything. Aristotle, who came after the Golden Age but who absorbed its thinking entirely, developed a theory of natural slavery, the idea that some human beings were by nature suited to be slaves, that their souls were structured for obedience rather than for reason, that slavery was therefore not an injustice but a reflection of the natural order. It is the most sophisticated philosophical defense of an evil institution that Western thought produced until the 19th century, and it was produced in Athens. Aristotle did not invent this idea. He systematized what the Athenians already believed, or needed to believe, in order to live the way they lived. Now consider the women. Half of Athens was female. Of that half, the citizen women, the metic women, the enslaved women, not one had a vote, a legal voice, or a political existence. The oikos was their world. The household was their jurisdiction, the city that named itself after a goddess, that placed a 40-foot image of a woman at the center of its most sacred building, that staged plays in which women spoke some of the most searching moral lines in all of ancient literature. That same city confined its actual women to rooms at the back of mud brick houses and handed their legal personhood to their fathers, then their husbands, then their sons. Euripides put Medea on the stage and let her say things no Athenian woman could say in public. He gave her arguments, rage, interiority, a complete moral life. The audience watched a woman think. A8B. And then they went home to wives who were legally not permitted to conduct a financial transaction above a certain modest value without male approval. The irony is not lost on anyone who looks at it directly. Athens produced the most psychologically sophisticated female characters in ancient literature. In a theater where women were not permitted to perform, possibly not permitted to attend, written by men, watched by men, as a kind of imagination of what women contained that the city otherwise refused to acknowledge. Then there are the metics, resident foreigners, perhaps 25,000 to 35,000 of them in Attica at the height of the Golden Age, merchants, craftsmen, teachers, physicians, bankers. They paid taxes. They served in the military when called. They ran workshops that produced much of Athens's exportable goods. They were, in many cases, more economically vital to the city than the citizens whose political world they were permanently excluded from. Herodotus, the man who invented history, who came to Athens because Athens was where the thinking was happening, was a metic. He could not vote. He could not own land in Attica. He could not hold any public office. He spent years in the most intellectually alive city in the world, contributing to its intellectual life, and had no formal stake in its governance. Anaxagoras, the philosopher who was Pericles' own intellectual mentor, the man who taught him to think, was a metic. He was eventually prosecuted for impiety and driven from Athens. A foreigner who shaped the mind of the man who shaped Athens, expelled by the city that owed him something it would not acknowledge. Aspasia, whose salon was a gathering point for the most brilliant minds in Athens, who influenced Pericles' thinking for decades. Metic, foreign-born, legally invisible, present at the center of everything, officially nowhere. The word democracy meant the power of the demos, the people. But the demos, in practice, was a specific subset of the people. Adult male citizens who had been born in Athens to Athenian parents. After Pericles himself introduced a citizenship law in 451 BCE, one of the great ironies, given that his own companion Aspasia could never have been a citizen under it, the definition tightened further. Both parents had to be Athenian citizens. The circle of who counted as the people closed inward. In a city of 300,000, the demos numbered perhaps 30,000 to 40,000, 1 in 10. The city that stood before the world as the proof of what human freedom could achieve had structured that freedom so that 9 out of every 10 people living within its walls were excluded from it. This is not a modern criticism imposed on an ancient civilization. The Athenians had the tools to see it. They had Socrates asking what justice was. They had Euripides staging the interior lives of people the city otherwise refused to recognize. They had the vocabulary, the philosophy, the intellectual tradition. What they did not have, or did not choose to exercise, was the will to turn that apparatus on the foundations of their own civilization. The philosophers questioned everything except the thing that made philosophy possible. And yet, the plays were real. The philosophy was real. The democracy, partial, contradictory, or built on exclusion, was still the most radical experiment in collective self-governance the world had produced. The gold was real gold, even if the foundations were hidden. Athens does not become less remarkable when you see the whole of it. It becomes more human, more like everything great that human beings have ever built, luminous on top, complicated underneath, containing within itself the contradiction it never fully resolved. The experiment was running, imperfectly, brilliantly, on borrowed time in ways nobody fully understood yet. The war was about to show them what borrowed time looks like when it runs out. In the summer of 431 BCE, the Spartan army crossed into Attica and began burning the farms. This was the opening move of a war that had been building for a generation. A war between Athens and Sparta that would last 27 years, consume the Greek world, and end with Athens on its knees. The Peloponnesian War. The war Thucydides would spend his life recording, and the rest of history would spend centuries trying to understand. The cause, in Thucydides' own words, was simple. The growth of Athenian power and the alarm that growth inspired in Sparta made the conflict structurally inevitable. Everything else, the specific incidents, the diplomatic failures, the provocations and counter-provocations, was noise. The underlying force was the same one that drives every great power conflict, one state growing too fast for its neighbors to tolerate, and those neighbors deciding that war now was better than submission later. Athens and Sparta were not merely rival cities, they were rival ideas about what human civilization should look like. Athens. Open, commercial, democratic, restless, built on argument and sea power and the energy of a city that had decided it was the center of the world. Sparta. Closed, agrarian, oligarchic, disciplined, built on the absolute subordination of the individual to the state, its male citizens living in barracks from the age of 7, trained for nothing except war. They had been allies against Persia. They had been uneasy partners in the Greek world for 50 years. By 431 BCE, the unease had become intolerable. Pericles had a strategy. It was rational, careful, and ultimately fatal. Athens could not match Sparta on land. The Spartan hoplite was the finest infantry soldier in the Greek world, the product of a military system so total that it consumed childhood, adolescence, and adult life in the service of producing a soldier who could not be broken. To meet the Spartan army in open battle was to lose. Pericles knew this, so he ordered the Athenians not to fight. The strategy was to withdraw the entire rural population of Attica behind the long walls that connected Athens to its port at Piraeus, let the Spartan army burn the farms, let them burn everything, and use the Athenian navy to raid the Peloponnesian coastline, disrupt Spartan supply lines, and wait. Athens controlled the sea. Athens had an empire that paid tribute. Athens could outlast the Spartans if it did not do the one thing the Spartans wanted it to do: come out and fight. The rural Athenians, the farmers who had worked the same land for generations, who watched from behind the walls as Spartan soldiers put fire to their orchards and pulled up their vines, obeyed. They crowded into Athens and Piraeus, in the corridor between them, sleeping in temples and public buildings and in tents pitched wherever space could be found. The population of Attica, normally spread across a region of 1,000 square miles, compressed into a few square miles of urban density. Then the plague arrived. It came through Piraeus first in the summer of 430 BCE, 1 year into the war. Nobody knew where it came from. Thucydides, who contracted it himself and survived, wrote that it had begun in Ethiopia, passed through Egypt and Libya, and then entered the Greek world. What it was exactly, the specific pathogen, has never been definitively identified. What it did is recorded in clinical detail that is still read by medical historians today, because Thucydides was the first person in history to describe an epidemic as a natural phenomenon worthy of precise empirical documentation. It began in the head. The eyes became red and inflamed. The throat and tongue bled. The breath turned fetid. Sneezing and hoarseness came next, then a violent cough, then vomiting. The skin broke out in small pustules and ulcers. The internal heat was so intense that victims tore off their clothing and plunged into cisterns of cold water, desperate for relief. Most could not sleep. Diarrhea followed, then extreme weakness. The majority died between the 7th and 9th day. Those who survived often lost their fingers, their toes, their sight. Some lost their memory entirely. They woke from the disease not knowing who they were. The city was not prepared for this. No city in the ancient world had the infrastructure to manage a plague of this scale and speed. The dead accumulated faster than they could be buried. Bodies were thrown onto funeral pyres that were already burning. Strangers piled on the pyres of other strangers, the ritual of proper burial abandoned because the living were too overwhelmed to perform it. The Spartans, camped in Attica burning farms, saw the smoke rising from the city and withdrew. They had no desire to go near whatever was happening inside those walls. What happened inside those walls was the dissolution of the social contract in real time. Thucydides watched it happen and described it with the precision of a man who understood that what he was witnessing was as historically significant as any battle. The certainty of death, the sense that you might be dead tomorrow regardless of anything you did or did not do, removed the incentive for moral behavior. Why restrain yourself? Why follow the laws? The gods clearly were not protecting the pious more than the impious. The plague killed both equally, without discrimination. The temples filled with corpses. Sacrilege that would have been unthinkable a year earlier became routine because the consequences of sacrilege, which were meant to be divine punishment, seemed no worse than the consequences of piety. The Athenians called it anomia, lawlessness, the state of being without the norms that make collective life possible. When they were not becoming evil, they were becoming rational in the most terrible way, responding accurately to a situation in which the ordinary calculations of social behavior no longer applied. Pericles died in 429 BCE. A version of the plague, or a secondary illness, claimed him. The man who had run Athens for 30 years, who had built the Parthenon and delivered the Funeral Oration and designed the strategy that was supposed to win the war, dead before the war was 3 years old. He left behind a city that had lost perhaps a quarter of its population, a strategy that depended on the discipline and unity of a people whose discipline and unity the plague had broken, and a democratic system that was structurally unable to produce another Pericles. The assembly, much freed from the gravitational pull of the one man who had held its confidence for decades, became available to whoever could sway it most effectively on a given day. What came next was demagogy, not as an insult, but as a description. Cleon, a leather tanner, the first Athenian leader of the democratic era who came from the commercial class rather than the aristocracy, rose to prominence through sheer force of oratorical aggression. He was loud, he was blunt, he was willing to say things that more refined politicians considered beneath them. He moved the assembly toward harder, crueler positions on the treatment of subject cities. When the island of Mytilene revolted against Athenian control and was suppressed, Cleon argued that all adult male citizens should be executed and the women and children enslaved. The assembly voted yes. A ship was dispatched. Then, the following day, the assembly changed its mind and sent a second, faster ship to overtake the first. It arrived in time. Barely. The war ground on. In its 10th year, it produced a peace of sorts, the Peace of Nicias, named after the Athenian general who negotiated it. It held for approximately 6 years before it was effectively dead in spirit, if not in name. And in the space of that uneasy pause, Athens made the decision that Thucydides would identify as the decisive act of self-destruction. In 415 BCE, a charismatic young aristocrat named Alcibiades, brilliant, reckless, beautiful, one of Socrates' most devoted admirers and one of the most dangerously compelling politicians Athens ever produced, convinced the assembly to send an expedition to Sicily. The stated purpose was to help a Sicilian city that had appealed to Athens for protection against its neighbors. The real purpose, which Alcibiades made almost no effort to conceal, was conquest. Syracuse, the dominant city of Sicily, was wealthy, powerful, and, if taken, would add to Athenian resources in ways that might decisively shift the balance of the war with Sparta. It was an extraordinary gamble, and it required an extraordinary force. Athens assembled the largest expedition it had ever sent anywhere. 134 warships, 27,000 men, soldiers, sailors, support personnel. It was, as Thucydides records with the controlled awe of a man who could not quite believe what he was documenting, the most expensive and splendid armament that had ever sailed from a single Greek city. The fleet left Piraeus in the summer of 415 BCE. The entire city turned out to watch. Citizens, foreigners, medics, slaves, everyone came to see it go. The scale of it was meant to project invincibility. It projected instead the particular hubris of a city that had come to believe that what it wanted, it could have. What followed was catastrophe of a completeness that even Thucydides, who had seen much, struggled to convey. The campaign went wrong from the beginning. Alcibiades, the expedition's primary architect, was recalled to Athens before the fighting began, accused of a religious scandal involving the mutilation of sacred statues on the night before the fleet departed. He fled to Sparta rather than face trial, and immediately began advising the Spartans on how to defeat his own city. The remaining commanders, Nicias and Lamachus could not agree on strategy. Lamachus was killed in combat. Nicias, who had opposed the expedition from the start and had been overruled, found himself in command of a war he had always believed was unwinnable. The Athenians besieged Syracuse for 2 years and failed to take it. Spartan reinforcements arrived. Athenian reinforcements arrived, extending the disaster rather than resolving it. The harbor at Syracuse was blockaded. The Athenian fleet, which had arrived as the most formidable naval force in the Greek world, was destroyed in the enclosed waters of the harbor. The same tactic, confined water, that had worked for Athens at Salamis, now working against it. The survivors attempted to retreat overland. They were pursued, picked off, cut down, captured. Of the 45,000 men who had participated in the expedition in one capacity or another, almost none returned. Nicias was executed. His captured soldiers were put to work in the stone quarries of Syracuse, exposed to the sun without shelter, given minimal food, dying slowly. Those who could recite passages from the plays of Euripides were sometimes treated better. Syracuse, even as Athens' enemy, recognized the value of what Athens had produced. The city that had funded the expedition could barely process what had happened. The treasure was gone, the ships were gone, the men were gone, and the war that had begun with Pericles' rational, careful strategy, had 9 more years to run. Athens lost in 404 BCE. Sparta occupied the city. A puppet government of 30 Athenian oligarchs, backed by Spartan power, answerable to Spartan interest, was installed. They are known as the 30 Tyrants, and in 8 months of rule, they killed approximately 1,500 Athenians, confiscated property, and exiled thousands more. The city that had invented democracy lived briefly under the most brutal oligarchy it had ever experienced. Then the exiles came back. Led by a general named Thrasybulus, the democratic forces recaptured Athens and restored the constitution in 403 BCE. An amnesty was declared, the first formal political amnesty in recorded history, a legal decision to not prosecute people for crimes committed before a certain date, to force the city to move forward rather than consuming itself in revenge. The democracy survived, battered, diminished, its empire gone, its treasury empty, its long walls torn down by Spartan order, but the democratic constitution, the assembly, the lot, the juries, all of it restored. The city was alive. It had survived the war, the plague, the 30 tyrants, and the amnesty. It had survived everything, almost everything. 4 years after the amnesty, in 399 BCE, Athens put Socrates on trial. 399 BCE. Athens has been a democracy again for 4 years. The city is still raw. The 30 tyrants killed 1,500 people in 8 months. The exiles who returned to restore the democracy did so at personal risk, and many of them lost property, friends, and family members to the oligarchic terror. The amnesty of 403 BCE, the legal agreement not to prosecute crimes committed before the Restoration, was a political necessity. It was also an open wound. The men who had collaborated with the 30 were walking the same streets as the men whose relatives the 30 had killed. Everyone knew who everyone was. Nobody was permitted to say anything about it. Into this atmosphere, 3 men brought a legal case. Their names were Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon. Meletus was a minor poet. Anytus was a prominent democratic politician who had played a significant role in the Restoration, a man with real power and real grievances. Lycon was an orator. Together they charged Socrates on 2 counts, impiety toward the gods of Athens and corruption of the youth. Socrates was 70 years old. He had been walking the Agora for decades. He had questioned generals, politicians, poets, and craftsmen. He had accumulated enemies the way a walking man accumulates dust, slowly, continuously, and without particular intention. He had associated closely with some of the most dangerous men of the previous generation: Alcibiades, who had betrayed Athens to Sparta, Cretias, who had been the most brutal of the 30 tyrants. Both had been disciples. Neither association could be legally cited under the amnesty, but both were present in the room, unspoken, as the charges were read. The real accusation was not impiety. The real accusation was what Socrates represented, or what a traumatized, defeated city needed him to represent. Athens in 399 BCE was a city trying to hold itself together. It had lost a war, it had lost an empire, it had lost a generation of men in Sicily. It had survived plague and oligarchy and the kind of civic violence that leaves marks on a city's soul that amnesty cannot erase. And it needed to believe in its gods, its institutions, its recovered democracy. And for 30 years, the most famous man in Athens had made his living, had made his life, out of demonstrating publicly that the things people were most confident about were the things they understood least: the gods. Socrates had a personal divine sign, a daimonion, an inner voice, that he claimed guided his decisions. It was not the same as the gods of the city. It was something private, interior, his own. In a city whose relationship to the divine was communal and civic, sacrifice performed together, festivals attended together, the gods' favor understood as a collective matter, a man with a private god was a theological problem. The youth? The young men who had followed Socrates through the Agora for years, who had watched him dismantle their father's certainties with gentle questions and then gone home and done the same at dinner, had, in some cases, gone on to become the enemies of Athens. The case that Socrates had corrupted them was not absurd, even if it was not quite accurate. The trial was held in the court of the Heliaia, 501 jurors chosen by lot, one day, each side given a fixed amount of water clock time to make their case. Socrates spoke for himself. What he said, as recorded by Plato, who was in the room in the Apology, was not what a man trying to be acquitted would say. He did not apologize. He did not moderate his position. He did not offer the jury the performance of humility they might have expected. Instead, he told them that he had been assigned by the god to examine the Athenians and their assumptions about wisdom, and that he would not stop doing this even if they freed him. That the unexamined life was not worth living. That if they killed him, they would harm themselves more than him, because Athens needed its gadfly, needed someone to sting it out of complacency, and men like him were not easily produced. He was not making it easy for anyone to vote for his acquittal. The jury voted to convict, 280 votes to 221. Then came the penalty phase. Under Athenian procedure, each side proposed a punishment, and the jury chose between them. The prosecution proposed death. Socrates asked to propose an alternative. The first suggested that he deserved to be rewarded with free meals at public expense, an honor given to Olympic champions, for his service to Athens. Under pressure from his friends, he eventually proposed a fine, a modest one. The jury, sensing either contempt or provocation in his manner, voted for death by a larger margin than they had voted for conviction. Socrates was taken to prison. Under Athenian law, executions could not be carried out while a sacred ship was at sea on a religious mission. By coincidence, the ship had departed the day before the trial. Socrates would have to wait approximately 30 days in prison before he could be killed. His friends came to him. Crito, a wealthy old friend, arrived before dawn one morning with a plan. The guards had been bribed. A boat was ready. Escape was entirely possible. Oh, and half of Athens expected it. Men convicted of lesser offenses routinely went into exile rather than face execution. Nobody would have stopped him. Many would have been relieved. Socrates refused. He told Crito that he had lived his entire life within the laws of Athens. He had benefited from those laws, been shaped by them, owed his education and his way of life to the city they governed. To escape now, to obey the laws when they benefited him and ignore them when they inconvenienced him, would be a kind of corruption more fundamental than anything he had been charged with. He would not do it. The laws of Athens had spoken. He would abide by them. He spent the 30 days in prison talking. Friends came every day. Crito, Phaedo, Simmias, Cabes, others whose names Plato records. But the conversations were about what they had always been about, the nature of the soul, the possibility of knowledge, whether death was something to be feared. Socrates argued that it was not. Either death was a dreamless sleep, nothing at all, nothing to fear, or it was a passage to another place where the examination could continue without the interference of the body. Both possibilities seemed fine to him. He had lived examining. He would die the same way. On the last day, his wife Xanthippe came with their youngest child. She was weeping. Socrates, characteristically, asked that she be taken away because the weeping was distracting. His friends stayed. They wept too, and he chided them for it, gently, with something that Plato records as almost amusement. When the prison official came with the hemlock, why Socrates asked him how to proceed. The official explained. Socrates thanked him, complimented him on his courtesy throughout the 30 days, and said he had been the kindest jailer a man could hope for. He drank the cup. He walked around the room until his legs grew heavy. Then he lay down. The paralysis moved upward from his feet. The official pressed his leg and asked if he could feel it, and he could not. The cold moved toward his heart. His last words, according to Plato, were a request to his friend Crito. They owed a rooster to Asclepius, the god of healing, and it should not be forgotten, the debt to the god of healing. Scholars have argued for centuries about what he meant. Some read it as irony, death as a cure for the disease of life. Some read it as genuine piety. It was a final act of religious obligation from a man accused of impiety. Some read it as Socrates being Socrates to the last, leaving behind a question rather than an answer, an obligation to interpret rather than a comfortable conclusion. Then he was still. Plato, who was in the room for the trial and may have been there for the death, who was young, aristocratic, devastated, and possessed of one of the most powerful minds of the ancient world, took what he had witnessed and spent the rest of his life building something from it. He wrote the dialogues, 36 of them, in which Socrates lives and argues and questions forever. He opened the Academy in 387 BCE, the first institution in Western history devoted to sustained philosophical inquiry, named for the grove outside Athens' walls where its members gathered. And he systematized the questions Socrates had asked into a philosophy of forms, a theory of knowledge, a vision of the ideal state. He attracted students from across the Greek world, including a 17-year-old from Macedonia named Aristotle, who arrived in 367 BCE and stayed for 20 years. The execution of Socrates, a city's act of self-protection against its most irritating conscience, produced the two most influential philosophical minds in Western history. The trial is the most revealing moment in Athenian history, precisely because it holds both truths at once. The democracy worked exactly as it was supposed to. 500 ordinary citizens heard a case, deliberated, and voted. The verdict was legal. The process was correct. Why, the outcome was the judicial murder of the man who had done more than anyone else in Athens to make its citizens think more carefully about what they believed and why. Athens killed the thing it most needed. Or, and this is the harder reading, Athens killed the thing it most needed, and in doing so sent it forward through time in a form that could never be killed. Socrates alive was one old man in one city asking questions that ended when he did. Socrates dead, recorded by Plato, became something the hemlock could not touch. The trial travels further through time than the Parthenon. The Parthenon is rubble with its best pieces in London. The trial of Socrates is still in session. Athens did not end with Socrates. That is the first thing to understand. The execution was not the conclusion. The city kept going. The assembly kept meeting. The courts kept selecting juries by lot. The theater kept staging plays every spring. Philosophers kept arguing in the Agora. The democracy that had just killed its most original mind went on functioning imperfectly, stubbornly, for another 80 years. And almost immediately it produced something extraordinary. Plato opened the Academy in 387 BCE, 12 years after the hemlock. He chose a grove of olive trees northwest of the city walls, a public gymnasium that had been a gathering place for philosophers and athletes for decades. He built a school, not in the modern institutional sense, not with fees and fixed curricula and examinations, but a community of inquiry, a place where people came to think together about the hardest questions. What is knowledge? What is justice? What is the good life? What kind of city, would allow human beings to live as well as they could. He wrote the dialogues, 36 of them, in which Socrates lives and argues forever, questions the hemlock could not touch, preserved in prose that has never gone out of circulation in 2,400 years. Every generation since has had to grapple with Plato, not because his answers are right, many of them are not, but because his questions are so precisely formulated that you cannot think seriously about ethics, politics, knowledge, or beauty without eventually finding yourself inside a conversation he started. In 367 BCE, 17 years after the academy opened, a 17-year-old arrived from the city of Stagira in Macedonia. His name was Aristotle. He stayed for 20 years, studying under Plato, arguing with Plato, or absorbing everything the academy had to offer, and then beginning, quietly and systematically, to build something different. Where Plato was a poet of philosophy, moving through ideas with the force of literary imagination, constructing myths and allegories to carry arguments that logic alone couldn't hold, Aristotle was a classifier, a systematizer, a man who looked at the world and saw that it could be organized, described, mapped. He did not merely philosophize. He invented biology as a discipline, dissecting and categorizing hundreds of animal species with a precision that would not be surpassed for nearly 2,000 years. He laid the foundations of formal logic, the rules of valid inference, that still underlie mathematics, computer science, and legal reasoning today. He wrote on physics, metaphysics, ethics, politics, or rhetoric, poetics, economics, meteorology, psychology. He built from the intellectual tradition that Athens had generated the first systematic body of knowledge in Western history. One of his students was a 13-year-old prince from Macedonia named Alexander. Alexander the Great, which is what the world would come to call him, conquered the Persian Empire, Egypt, and much of Central Asia before his death at 32. He was a military genius of a kind that appears perhaps once in a millennium. He was also a man who slept with a copy of Homer under his pillow and carried the Iliad annotated by Aristotle on his campaigns. He founded cities across the territories he conquered: Alexandria in Egypt, Alexandria in Persia, Alexandria in Afghanistan, and in each of them he planted the institutional structures of Greek intellectual life: libraries, gymnasia, philosophical schools. He did not merely conquer the world, he Hellenized it. He spread the language, the literature, the philosophy, the art, the architecture of the Greek tradition, of the Athenian tradition, from the Mediterranean to the borders of India. This was not something Athens planned. It was something Athens made possible. The city that produced Aristotle produced the teacher of the man who spread its ideas across the known world. Athens itself was absorbed by Macedon after the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE, the battle at which Philip II of Macedon defeated a coalition of Greek city-states, including Athens, and ended Athenian political independence. The assembly continued to meet. The democracy continued to function in its internal affairs. But Athens was no longer a sovereign power. It was a city within someone else's empire. Then Rome came. The Roman general Sulla sacked Athens in 86 BCE, punishment for Athens having sided with Mithridates of Pontus against Rome, in a conflict that was not Athens's war to fight, but that Athens, with the particular stubbornness of a city that remembered what it once had been, got involved in anyway. Sulla stripped the city of much of its remaining treasure. He pulled up trees from the Academy Grove to build siege weapons. He did not, however, destroy what made Athens Athens, because Rome could not afford to. The Romans were, in their relationship to Greek culture, the most flattering and complicated conquerors in history. They had conquered Greece militarily, or Greece had conquered Rome intellectually. Roman senators quoted Thucydides in debates about imperial policy. Roman generals read Xenophon before campaigns. Roman aristocrats sent their sons to Athens to be educated, the way a later era would send its sons to Oxford or Paris, because Athens remained, even as a provincial city within a vast empire, the place where the serious thinking was understood to happen. Cicero studied in Athens. So did Julius Caesar's assassins Brutus and Cassius. Augustus, the first Roman emperor, visited Athens and treated it with a reverence that bordered on the religious. The emperors Nero and Hadrian were not merely admirers of Athens, they were devotees, funding building projects, attending festivals, positioning themselves as the inheritors of Athenian civilization. The Parthenon stood through all of it. Through the Roman conquest, through the conversion of the empire to Christianity, through the sacking by the Heruli in 267 CE and the Visigoths in 396 CE. Through all of this, the building stood on its hill, the mathematical corrections for human perception still bending reality into the appearance of perfection, the columns still not quite straight, the floor still not quite flat. Then the Parthenon became a church, then a mosque. Then, in 1687, a Venetian cannonball struck the Ottoman powder magazine that had been stored inside it. The explosion blew out the heart of the building, the roof gone, the walls fractured, the interior open to the sky. Then, in the early 19th century, Lord Elgin arrived with chisels and scaffolding and removed the surviving sculptural friezes, the carved marble panels that Phidias had designed, the figures that had watched over Athens for 2,000 years, and shipped them to London, where they remain today in the British Museum, their return requested by Greece for decades and consistently refused. The building that calculated the appearance of perfection now stands as a ruin. But here is what is stranger and more durable than the building. The ideas did not decay. Philosophy did not end with the academy. It traveled through the Stoics, through Epicurus, through the Neoplatonists, into the Roman world, into the early Christian church, into the Islamic intellectual tradition that preserved and extended Aristotle during the European Dark Ages, and then back into Western Europe during the medieval period, where Thomas Aquinas spent his scholarly life trying to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology. The argument between Athens and Jerusalem, between reason and revelation, between philosophy and faith, is one of the organizing arguments of Western civilization, and it has never been resolved because Athens keeps making points that Jerusalem cannot quite answer, and Jerusalem keeps making points that Athens cannot quite dismiss. The theater did not end with Sophocles. Every theatrical tradition that followed, Roman comedy, Renaissance drama, the plays of Shakespeare and Molière, and Ibsen and Chekhov, descends in direct and traceable lineage from the form that Athens invented in a limestone bowl on a hillside in the 5th century BCE. The three unities of drama, action, time, place, that shaped European theater for centuries came from Aristotle's analysis of Greek tragedy. The word comedy comes from Athens. The word tragedy comes from Athens. The word theater comes from Athens. The democracy did not end with Chaeronea. The concept, the radical, structurally improbable idea that people should govern themselves, that power should derive from the consent of the governed, that every voice should count, traveled through Rome, through Renaissance city-states, through the English Revolution, through the American and French revolutions, into the political architecture of modernity. The founding fathers of the United States knew the Athenian precedent intimately. They studied it, argued about it, worried about its failures. They built a republic rather than a direct democracy, partly because they feared what Athens had demonstrated, that direct democracy could produce Cleon and the Sicilian expedition as readily as it produced Pericles and the Parthenon. The medicine did not end with Hippocrates. The idea that disease has natural causes, that the physician's job is to observe, record, reason, and intervene on the basis of evidence rather than prayer, is the founding premise of every medical tradition that has extended human life. Every doctor who has ever washed their hands before an operation, every researcher who has ever designed a clinical trial, every patient who has ever been told their cancer has a specific biological cause rather than being a punishment from God. All of them are living downstream of the question Hippocrates asked on the island of Kos in the 5th century BCE. The history did not end with Thucydides. Political leaders have read his account of the Peloponnesian War in every century since he wrote it. because the dynamics he identified, the fear of a rising power, the overreach of an established one, the way democratic institutions can be captured by demagogues in a crisis, recur with a regularity that suggests he was describing not just one war, but a structure that repeats. Henry Kissinger wrote his doctoral thesis on Thucydides. American military and foreign policy establishments assign his work as required reading. B. The Melian Dialogue, the section in which Athenian envoys tell the small island of Melos that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, is studied in international relations programs because it describes, with uncomfortable accuracy, how powerful states have always behaved. The philosophy did not end with Plato's death. It produced Aristotle, who produced an intellectual tradition, which produced the European university system, which produced the scientific revolution, which produced the modern world. The line is not straight. It bends and fractures and disappears and reappears over 2.5 millennia. But it is traceable. What Athens produced between 490 and 399 BCE in one city on a rocky peninsula, D, with no great river and thin soil and a population roughly the size of a modern mid-sized town, did not stay in Athens. It could not be contained there. The Persian Wars proved that Athens could survive destruction. The trial of Socrates proved that Athens could even survive destroying itself. What it could not do, what nobody could do, was contain what it had released. The ideas were out. They had been tested in the limestone bowl and the Agora and the Andron and the jury courts and the silver mines and the corridors of the Parthenon. They had been refined by argument and broken by war and distorted by politics and killed by hemlock and carried forward anyway. By Plato, by Aristotle, by Alexander's armies, by Roman senators, by Islamic scholars working in Baghdad in the 9th century, by monks copying manuscripts in the 11th, by Renaissance humanists in the 15th, by revolutionaries in the 18th, by scientists in the 19th and 20th, by the courts and constitutions and hospitals and theaters and universities and democracies, however imperfect, that the 21st century is still trying to build. A city of perhaps 300,000 people, most of whom were excluded from the things it is most remembered for, produced an inheritance that the entire subsequent history of civilization has not been able to spend. That is not a small thing. That is what the experiment produced. That is what was in the water.